Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the HOA that sold my house while I was away. It all started the day before my flight out of the country. About a year and a half ago, I remember standing in my driveway, making a mental checklist of everything I needed to handle before leaving for a few weeks. My father, a retired Navy medic who served back in an era when our nation demanded incredible sacrifices from its servicemen, had fallen ill while staying with a relative in a small, out-of-the-way country known for specialized physical therapy treatments that he couldn't easily find at home. He'd gone there a few months earlier to get a handle on lingering nerve issues stemming from his service years. Now his health had taken a downward turn and I needed to be with him, help manage his care and, if necessary, bring him back home. When I left, my only real worry was arranging for a house sitter. I had a small, comfortable place in a quiet neighborhood. It was no castle, but it was mine. And I took pride in the bright yellow front door and the tiny flower bed out front. My home's value hovered around $120,000 in our local market, though I'd never considered selling. I'd inherited it after my mother passed, and after fixing it up gradually over the years, it was more than just property. It was memory and stability rolled into one. But to keep it in a certain aesthetic order, I had to deal with an HOA that loved to play petty tyrant. In the past, I'd paid every fee on time, followed every nonsensical guideline they threw at me, and tried my best to be a good neighbor. I never suspected the trouble would explode the moment my back was turned. I had arranged with a close friend, Mateo, to keep an eye on the house while I was gone. Mateo was a kind soul who lived a few blocks away and loved my little garden patch. Before I left, he and I spent a morning cutting the grass close, tidying the hedges, and tucking garden hoses neatly out of sight. Our HOA had rules about hoses visible from the street, believe it or not, and I wanted no trouble in my absence. My flight was early the next day. That evening, I took a slow walk down my street to enjoy the fresh autumn air. The neighborhood was quiet, lit by warm porch lights. Nothing seemed amiss. I left the next morning, flew out, and within a day I was sitting by my father's bedside in a foreign hospital. The medical staff spoke a language I barely understood, but the nurses were compassionate, and my father, though weak, was alert enough to greet me with a slight smile. His health required me to shuttle between different therapy centers, arrange consultations, and handle payments for treatments that weren't covered by his American insurance. It was complicated, stressful, and more time-consuming than I'd anticipated. What I'd planned as a few weeks abroad stretched to a couple of months, then several months more. I ended up staying nearly a full year, seeing my father through multiple stages of his rehabilitation, coordinating with doctors who specialized in military-related nerve damage. For a time, my life revolved around his recovery. My house back home became a distant concern. Mateo would email me photos now and again showing everything looking normal. When I called him, he reported no issues at first, but about 8 months into my stay abroad, Mateo's tone changed. He sent me a message saying I should call him immediately. When I reached him by phone, he sounded upset. He said a stranger had shown up at my place, taking pictures through the front windows and trying keys on the door. Mateo confronted the man, who claimed he'd purchased the property for a terrific price. Mateo knew something was off because I had never mentioned selling, nor put the house on the market. Mateo told him this was obviously a misunderstanding or a scam. The man responded by holding up a stack of documents that he insisted proved he owned the place. My heart dropped when I heard this. How on earth could anyone claim they owned my house? I thought maybe it was some sort of deed fraud or a crooked investor targeting empty homes. That evening, I emailed the HOA board, politely asking if they knew anything about a change in records. I got no reply. I emailed again a couple of days later. Still nothing. Mateo confronted the man a second time when he returned to the property with a locksmith, and this time the fellow showed Mateo a strange title transfer document and something that looked like a sale receipt. The sale price? A shockingly low $7,000. $7,000. For a home worth over $120,000, it was mind-boggling. This was a red flag if I'd ever seen one. With panic rising in my chest, I phoned a local attorney I knew vaguely through a friend. Her name was Rachel, and although she specialized in estate planning, she knew her way around property laws. Rachel listened carefully to my story and advised that I gather all documents related to my home ownership: deed, HOA bylaws, payment records, anything that could help prove that I never authorized a sale. She explained that sometimes HOAs have the power to foreclose on properties if owners rack up large debts or fines. but I had never received notice of foreclosure, nor fallen behind on HOA dues. Rachel warned me that if the HOA had done something underhanded, proving it from overseas could be complicated. She suggested I return as soon as possible. I was torn. My father still needed my care. He was better than before, but not fully stable. I couldn't just abandon him. After a few days of anxious deliberation, I arranged for a trusted relative to come over and help him. I needed to get back home and sort this mess out. A month later, I flew back. By the time I landed, it was just past the 1-year mark of my leaving. I got a ride straight from the airport to my neighborhood and saw something that nearly made me collapse on the spot. My home's yard was torn up, my garden was gone, and someone had replaced my cheerful yellow front door with a cheap-looking brown one. The blinds were different. There was a sign in the window that said something about a remodeling company. My heart pounded as I approached. I didn't even have keys that would fit the new locks. I knocked. No one answered. I walked around to the backyard where I found a stack of construction materials. My shed had been forcibly opened, its door hinges mangled. Inside, my garden tools and personal belongings were scattered. I immediately called Mateo. He rushed over, eyes wide with disbelief. He said that a group of people had come by over the past couple of weeks. He tried asking what they were doing, and they claimed they were getting their investment ready to flip. According to them, they'd purchased the property through the HOA's foreclosure auction. Foreclosure auction? That was absurd. I had always kept up with my HOA dues. I'd never even been late. I had automatic payments set up. Surely this was a mistake. I left Mateo guarding the property line while I drove straight to the HOA management office. I walked in, and the receptionist looked startled. She must have recognized me. Without much prompting, she fetched the HOA president, a man named Dwight. Dwight was always a slick talker, the kind of guy who never gave a straight answer. He was tall, thin, had a permanent tan, and wore polo shirts even in winter. Dwight and I had crossed paths before, but never had serious issues. I demanded an explanation. He pulled out a file and showed me a series of documents claiming that I had failed to pay HOA dues for 12 consecutive months and ignored multiple certified letters. He said the HOA had the right to place a lien and eventually sell the house at public auction to recoup the unpaid amount, plus fees, of course. I countered that I had automatic payments and I had never received any letters. Dwight shrugged, saying letters were sent, and it wasn't the HOA's problem if I didn't read them. He claimed they had followed the usual procedure: letters, warnings, a lien, then an auction. The fact that I had never seen these letters, never signed for any certified mail, never heard from my house sitter about it, all seemed irrelevant to him. He handed me a copy of a final notice letter that looked suspicious. The address on it was slightly off, like someone had deliberately changed the house number. This smelled like fraud. I took these documents to Rachel. She immediately spotted major irregularities. For one, the HOA claimed unpaid dues, but I had bank statements showing monthly payments leaving my account. Rachel also noted that the certified letters supposedly had tracking numbers, but when we checked them online, the postal records didn't match deliveries to my address. It looked like these letters had never actually reached me, or maybe were never truly sent to me. My next step was to talk to the so-called investor who claimed he owned my place. His name was Byron, and I managed to catch him at the property one morning. He seemed nervous to see me. Byron said he'd purchased the house at the HOA's foreclosure sale for $7,000. He insisted he had legal right to be there. When I asked him for his attorney's contact information, he hesitated and then rattled off a number that turned out to be disconnected. This was getting stranger by the minute. Byron looked less like a real investor and more like someone working hand in hand with the HOA to pull off a scheme. At this point, I decided I was going to fight back with everything I had. Rachel helped me file a lawsuit against the HOA for wrongful foreclosure, fraud, and illegal eviction. We sought an injunction to halt any renovations or resale attempts until the case resolved. To strengthen my case, I carefully documented every payment I had made, every piece of correspondence I had on file with the HOA. I even dug up old meeting minutes I'd downloaded years earlier that outlined the HOA's procedures for foreclosures, none of which matched what they claimed to have done. I also contacted other neighbors. One couple down the street, Paula and Rick, told me they'd noticed something unusual. They received a letter in their mailbox addressed to me from the HOA at a completely incorrect number. Instead of my house number, it listed some non-existent address a few blocks away. Paula, thinking it was a simple mail misdelivery, tried to return it to the HOA, but when she dropped by their office, the receptionist brushed her off, saying it didn't matter. Paula thought that was odd and mentioned it to me now. This proved that the HOA might have been deliberately misaddressing my notices, so I would never receive them. The puzzle pieces started fitting together. I suspected that Dwight or someone on the HOA board had engineered a sham foreclosure to snatch up my house at a ridiculously low price, intending to flip it for a huge profit. The reason, my house, although modest, sat on a corner lot with good sunlight and a newly renovated interior. Perfect for a quick turnover at a big profit, but they needed me out of the picture first. With me overseas taking care of my father, I was an easy target. They must have thought I wouldn't come back soon or wouldn't have the resources to fight. What they didn't count on was my determination. I wasn't going to let them steal the home I'd poured my heart into. So, I pressed on with the lawsuit. This wasn't quick or easy. Legal battles rarely are. My father's health updates filtered in from abroad, and while he was improving, the stress weighed on me. I had to trust that he was in good hands there so I could focus on this crisis at home. Before the hearing, my attorney Rachel arranged for a preliminary meeting with the HOA's legal team. Their lawyer was a curt, gray-haired gentleman named Victor who tried to bully me into settling. He offered to have the HOA buy back my home from Byron and sell it back to me for $20,000. I was flabbergasted by the nerve. They basically wanted me to pay ransom to get my own home back. I refused, saying I would see them in court. During discovery, Rachel subpoenaed the HOA's financial records and payment histories. Surprise, surprise. Every single one of my dues payments had gone through. The HOA's own records showed that my account was never delinquent. Yet, on the foreclosure documents, they claimed non-payment for an entire year. They couldn't explain this discrepancy. We also obtained the alleged certified mail receipts. The signatures were scribbles that matched no one in my household, and the delivery addresses didn't match my home address. It seemed like they'd staged fake notice attempts. Byron's purchase documents also raised questions. The auction date listed didn't match any official public foreclosure auction schedule in our county. The auction might have taken place in a conference room at the HOA's management office, with only their hand-picked buyer present. It wasn't a legitimate public sale. As this evidence stacked up, I could see the HOA's confidence fading. Dwight, who had previously smirked through our encounters, now avoided making eye contact. At the next HOA meeting, one I attended with a group of concerned neighbors, Dwight tried to pass off the entire incident as a clerical error. I stood up, calmly showed everyone the false documents, and read aloud some of the tampered addresses. The crowd gasped. A few HOA board members looked genuinely shocked, as if they hadn't been in on Dwight's plot. Others looked pale and guilty. A week before the trial, something unexpected happened. Byron showed up at my friend Mateo's house asking to talk. When I arrived, Byron was sitting on Mateo's porch, fidgeting. He confessed that Dwight approached him months earlier with what looked like a golden opportunity: buy my house for $7,000 at a foreclosure auction the HOA was holding. Dwight said I'd abandoned the property and hadn't paid dues in a year, and that the HOA was exercising its right to foreclose. Byron was new to real estate investing and didn't know the proper procedure. He'd never bought a foreclosed property before. He admitted he should have checked public records, but he took Dwight's word at face value and wrote the check. Now he realized he was caught in something illegal. I asked Byron if he'd testify to that in court. He hesitated. I said if he cooperated, I might not pursue legal action against him personally, since he looked more like a patsy than a co-conspirator. Byron agreed to think about it. A few days later, his attorney contacted Rachel, saying Byron would indeed testify that Dwight orchestrated the fake foreclosure. The trial started about 4 months after I got back. My father, though still weak, managed to send a notarized letter explaining that I had to leave the country for his care and had no intention of abandoning my home. The judge, a serious-looking woman with sharp eyes, listened patiently as Rachel presented our case. We showed payment logs, we showed mismatched addresses, we brought in neighbors to testify they never saw any public auction notices, and we presented Byron's testimony that Dwight arranged everything. The HOA's defense fell apart. Dwight's attorney tried to argue that everything was just a big misunderstanding, but there were too many mistakes for anyone to believe it was an accident. This was clearly intentional fraud. The judge ruled in my favor. She declared the foreclosure sale void, restoring me as the rightful owner of my home. She ordered the HOA to pay me damages. Although I cannot mention exact figures, let's just say it amounted to significantly more than the property's market value. The HOA was also ordered to cover all my legal fees. Byron got a stern lecture from the judge for failing to do his due diligence, but since he cooperated and had clearly been misled, he didn't face any major penalties except losing the $7,000 he'd paid. He could take that up with Dwight privately. Dwight, on the other hand, faced serious repercussions. Not only did he lose his position as HOA president, but the homeowners banded together to remove him from the board entirely. I heard later that several homeowners filed a separate civil suit against him for mismanagement and fraud, though I wasn't a party to that. But the story doesn't end just with the courtroom victory. After the trial, the HOA's insurance premiums shot up. They had to rework their entire foreclosure process under careful legal guidance. The board's other members implemented transparency measures. Meanwhile, I reclaimed my home, changed the locks, and started restoring the garden. I replaced the front door with a new one. This time, I chose a calm, slate blue shade instead of bright yellow. This was a fresh start. I also had to clean up a huge mess inside. The investors had stripped parts of the kitchen, removed my old wooden cabinets, and torn down a load-bearing wall that I now had to reinforce. The damages were extensive, but the monetary settlement covered repairs. I hired a reputable contractor and made the place even nicer than before. Throughout the renovation process, neighbors stopped by to offer support. Paula and Rick brought homemade cookies when the repairs were done. Mateo helped me replant the flower bed and hang new shutters. The community felt more unified than before, perhaps because they had seen what could happen if they let the HOA run wild without accountability. My father eventually came home as well. After a long and grueling therapy program abroad, he regained enough mobility to travel. He arrived to find the house looking better than ever, stronger, brighter, and now safely out of the HOA's clutches. I showed him the final court documents. He shook his head in disbelief, then patted me on the shoulder, saying, "I always knew you'd do whatever it took to protect what matters." As life settled back into a normal rhythm, I learned a valuable lesson. Always keep track of your payments, keep a paper trail, and never let someone bully you into giving up what's yours without a fight. I had allowed myself to trust that following all the rules would protect me, but in reality, it was my vigilance, documentation, and willingness to stand up in court that ultimately saved my home. I also spent time reflecting on how easily a corrupt individual can abuse the system. Dwight likely thought I'd never come back or never have the resources to fight. He underestimated the love I have for my father and my home. He also underestimated the neighbors who, though busy with their own lives, still valued fairness and honesty. Without Paula and Rick's memory of that misaddressed letter, Mateo's watchful eye, and Byron's eventual honesty, I might not have succeeded. In the aftermath, the new HOA board reached out to me, hoping to mend fences. They offered to personally monitor my property for compliance and apologized on behalf of the association. While I appreciated the sentiment, I made it clear I would be watching them too. Gone were the days when I'd accept their word without verification. I moved my HOA payments to a different account, one that I monitored monthly. I set up a certified mail log so that I would know if they ever tried that trick again. And I made sure to attend HOA meetings, speak up on policy changes, and advocate for more homeowner rights and stricter oversight of the board's activities. Over time, the HOA started introducing reforms. They posted all notices publicly on a community bulletin board and online portal. They offered digital confirmations for dues payments. The community began to trust the HOA again, bit by bit, because now the checks and balances were in place to prevent a repeat of my ordeal. Ironically, my nightmare prompted positive changes that benefited everyone. I can't say I'm grateful for the stress and the heartbreak, but I am proud that I stood my ground. I didn't let them steal my home. I fought, I sued, and I won. In the end, justice prevailed, though it came at a cost. My father and I are stronger for having weathered these storms, and my house now stands as a testament to perseverance. No matter how carefully you follow the rules, there can always be someone who tries to take advantage. The key is to be ready to stand up for yourself when it matters most. One more thing happened weeks after the trial that felt like a quiet validation. Byron stopped by to apologize again, and he brought along a potted plant, a small citrus sapling. He said it symbolized a fresh start. It was an unexpected gesture from someone who'd once tried to claim my home as his own. I accepted the plant and put it in my backyard, not far from my restored flower beds. I didn't fully trust Byron, and I probably never would, but I appreciated the effort. People can make bad choices, and sometimes they try to redeem themselves. It doesn't erase the damage, but it's a gesture of humility and recognition that what happened was wrong. With the legal battle behind me, I focused again on my father's health, my career, and the community that surrounded me. My father needed follow-up therapy sessions at home, so I hired a physical therapist who visited twice a week. The therapist, a kind individual named Keisha, helped him improve his mobility further. She and I often chatted about home safety adaptations, so I had handrails installed in the hallway and an accessible bathroom layout implemented. These improvements made daily life easier for my father and added to the home's overall comfort. My relationship with the neighbors deepened as we bonded over the shared realization that we needed to keep an eye on the HOA and stand together if anything questionable happened again. Several neighbors began attending board meetings regularly. We started a community newsletter to keep everyone informed. It wasn't just about preventing fraud. It was about building a real neighborhood spirit, where everyone looked out for one another. Before this ordeal, I barely knew a few of my neighbors beyond a casual wave. Now, many of us chatted in the evenings, shared gardening tips, and even organized a small block party to celebrate the restored trust in the neighborhood's governance. At that block party, Paula approached me and asked if I'd consider running for a position on the HOA board, just to keep things honest. She said the community respected my courage and integrity. I was flattered, but I declined. I explained that I had enough on my plate, caring for my father, maintaining my home, and focusing on my personal life. Still, I promised to stay active, attend meetings, and help keep the board accountable. Dwight tried to disappear quietly. Rumor had it that he moved to a different part of town and was trying to start fresh in another community. I couldn't help but wonder if he'd attempt similar schemes elsewhere, but I consoled myself with the fact that at least he'd never try it in our neighborhood again. Once the legal verdict came down, I also reported his activities to the state's division that oversees homeowner associations, including all the documents we uncovered. Even if he tried to pull something similar, there might be a record following him around now. The insurance company for the HOA also took a hit. Their underwriters increased rates and demanded that the HOA enact strict compliance training for all board members. We saw new faces in the HOA management office. Gone was the old receptionist who always had a smug look. The new staff seemed professional, neutral, and more than willing to provide records on request. This level of transparency went a long way in restoring community trust. By the time my father was well enough to join me in small neighborhood gatherings, people greeted him warmly, thanked him for his service, and asked how he was feeling. He would sit on a folding chair under a shade tree, watching me replant flowers or paint the fence. When I told him the whole saga of the HOA, he shook his head and said, "I fought for our country, and I guess you had to fight for your home." That about summed it up. In one way or another, we were both veterans of a sort. He of actual warfare, me of a legal battle to protect what was rightfully ours. I also found myself thinking about the deeper lessons. It's easy to feel powerless when a group like an HOA decides to break its own rules. But the reality is that systems designed to protect property owners from fraud do exist. And if you have the courage and resources, you can expose wrongdoing. The legal route isn't always easy, but truth has a way of surfacing if you persist. That lesson extended beyond this particular problem. It taught me to question suspicious situations, trust my instincts, and never be afraid to ask for help when fighting injustice. During the long weeks of waiting for the court dates, I'd sometimes worry about my father, about finances, about whether I'd come home to a completely demolished property. Those nights were sleepless and full of dread. But when the sun rose each day, I told myself to push forward, one step at a time. The eventual victory reminded me that perseverance and patience often go hand in hand. Justice can be slow, but it's not always blind. After I finished the major repairs and restorations to the house, I also indulged in a few improvements I'd always wanted, like upgrading the insulation and installing energy-efficient windows. I figured if I'd gone through all this trouble, I might as well come out the other side with a home better than before. The settlement money allowed me to invest in these upgrades without stress. In a strange way, the HOA's corruption ended up benefiting me materially. Of course, I would have preferred to skip the nightmare altogether, but at least I could make something positive out of it. As for Rachel, my attorney, we became good friends. She admired how I kept meticulous records and documentation. After our victory, she asked if I'd consider speaking at a local homeowner education workshop she was organizing. The idea was to help other homeowners understand their rights, recognize red flags, and protect themselves from predatory HOA practices. I agreed, feeling that if I could help others avoid what I went through, it would give more meaning to the ordeal. At that workshop, I stood in front of a small audience of concerned homeowners and recounted my experience. I emphasized the importance of reading your HOA's governing documents, knowing your payment records, and not hesitating to consult an attorney if something feels off. The attendees asked thoughtful questions, and several thanked me afterward for sharing my story. Time passed. My father continued to recover, each day a little stronger. We settled into a routine. I started a small vegetable patch in the backyard, something I'd always wanted. My father enjoyed sitting outside, watching me tend the plants, and he'd point out what I was doing right or wrong. I also reconnected with old friends I'd neglected while away. Life began to feel stable and normal again. In a quiet moment, I realized that the key reason I won wasn't just my documentation or my attorney's skill. It was my refusal to roll over and accept a wrong. The HOA relied on the assumption that homeowners would be too intimidated, too confused, or too exhausted to fight back. By refusing to let them get away with it, I not only reclaimed my home, but also taught them and the whole neighborhood a lesson. Occasionally, I think back to that foreign hospital room where I first got the call from Mateo about the stranger taking pictures through my window. How far I'd come since that moment of panic. I never imagined I would become something of a community activist, nor did I foresee leading a fight against fraudulent activities by an HOA board. Yet life is full of unexpected turns, and often your character is revealed by how you handle adversity. A couple of years after the ordeal, as I sat on my front steps watching the sunset, Paula stopped by with a small plate of fresh pastries she'd baked. We chatted about how quiet and pleasant the neighborhood had become. No more strange foreclosure rumors, no more shady deals, and no more misdirected letters. It almost felt as if a dark cloud had lifted. I heard through the grapevine that the HOA instituted mandatory ethics training for board members. They had also hired a reputable management company to oversee dues and records. The community was safer for all of us now. In the end, I got to keep my home, secure my father's return, receive a significant payout, and watch as the wrongdoers faced consequences. The best outcome, though, was that I turned a personal tragedy in the making into a cause for neighborhood improvement. The place I call home is no longer just a roof over my head. It's a symbol of resilience, community spirit, and the power of standing up for one's rights. Friends, thank you. See you soon.